there's no question that sort of what makes Airbnb so fascinating and so challenging is it does blur these boundaries between these sort of tourist spheres and geographic regions. And it's like, okay, if I go to the Louvre, like I'm going to be surrounded by tourists. Like if I live in Paris and I go to the Louvre, like I know that that's okay. If I go to the Eiffel Tower, I'm going to be surrounded by tourists. But it used to be, but if I go back to my condo building, then I'm not. Mm-hmm. But now Airbnb has blurred those boundaries, and now suddenly the condo building and, the neighborhood street are also sort of quote unquote touristified.
That was my guest, Dr. Daniel Guttentag, a professor of hospitality and tourism management at the College of Charleston. It's just a sneak peek into our conversation that kicks off this entire season that's going to dive into this issue of short-term rentals that so many people are feeling, whether it be in small cities, medium cities, small rural areas, but people are feeling this across the globe. And so throughout this whole season, I'll be talking with people from different perspectives to see all of the different ways that people are trying to attack these negative issues that are coming with, we say short-term rentals, but as you'll find out as the season unfolds, it might not necessarily be short-term rentals in general that are the issue, but rather simply the way that Airbnb does business. I chose to kick off the season with Daniel and I's conversation because we're both tourism scholars, and it's hard to have a conversation about Airbnb, about short-term rentals without tourism being kind of tossed around from both sides. Either we're doing it in the name of tourism or we are mad at tourism on the other side. And so both of us kind of come from this mutual understanding that we can't necessarily tackle problems that are related to tourism without bringing in these perspectives of all different people. Part of that being the fact that short-term rentals are not new. Short-term rentals did not get introduced with Airbnb. They have been around in some tourism destinations well before the technology for Airbnb even existed. So how do we make sure that we're still providing opportunities for the tourists to have places to stay, opportunities for residents in those communities to make money and to benefit from tourism in those communities, how we can help and not just be mad at our elected officials and lawmakers in fighting some of the tactics that you'll hear throughout the season, some of the tactics that Airbnb employs to make sure that once it gets its fingers in a community, it's so hard to get it out. Because the one thing that we could all agree on throughout this season is, for one, we're not going to tackle this problem alone. One group, one perspective is not going to be able to tackle this problem. And for two, we're not going to be able to tackle the problem until we can actually hold the platform itself accountable. So as much as it may make us feel better in the moment to squirt tourists with water guns or to graffiti outside of known Airbnb places in our neighborhood, what you'll find out from this season is those tactics are really the result of a lot of misplaced anger. And they really alone won't do much to stop what's already happening. Maybe you're just starting to notice some of the negative impacts happening in your neighborhood, then be sure to subscribe so that you can see all of the different episodes as they unfold. And like I said, together, maybe we can all start figuring out ways that we as tourists and community members can play a role in making this happen. So to kick things off, here's my conversation with Dr. Daniel Guttentag. I hope you enjoy it as much as I enjoyed having it. All right, welcome to the You're a Tourist podcast, where we get very serious and share a laugh or two about all the good, the bad, and the ugly parts of tourism that you may or may not have ever even thought about. I am your host, Dr. Katie Dudley, and my guest today is an associate professor of hospitality and tourism management at the College of Charleston. He's published some of the first work warning us about the disruptive nature of Airbnb, and he's continued to study it from a variety of perspectives. Welcome to the show, Dr. Daniel Guttentag.
Yeah, very kind introduction. Thank you, and I'm pleased to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
All right. So we're going to dive into all of the different all of your work and the articles as we go through. But why don't you just kind of kick us off and give us an overview of the work that you do and really kind of what got you interested in studying it in the first place?
Sure. Maybe I'll start with that second question first, actually.
There we go.
So, if we go back in time, I did my master's degree looking at tourism policy and planning. And then I was actually up in Toronto at the time, or up in Canada. I studied at the University of Waterloo. I moved to Toronto and got a job working with the Toronto Convention and Visitors Bureau. So basically the Tourism Bureau of Toronto. And I was doing research and essentially data and numbers for them. And so that really threw me into the whole industry side of things. And I was doing reports every week, every month on hotel metrics, hotel performance. So while we were looking at tourism comprehensively, always hotels were a big part of that, equation. So I sort of through that became really interested in the lodging sector. And then at the same time, I'd sort of for a while just sort of had a secondary interest in technology, just sort of how it impacts society. I'd worked previously in internet marketing, like search engine optimization stuff outside of hospitality and tourism. So I'm sort of in this place where I'm working with lodging numbers all the time and following the news about what's new in travel and technology. And this goes back to, 2013, 2014, like really early in the days of Airbnb. And so I start to hear these sort of first rumblings about Airbnb, and it's just like, wow, that sounds cool. It sort of has all my interests. And at the time, no one had really heard of it. It was there, but it was tiny.
Yeah.
But it just sort of felt like this is going to be big. And it was one of those things like, it makes sense. Like, I wish I'd thought of that. I'd be the billionaire, right? Like, why isn't this me? Like, it's going to work. And then, so I worked at the Visitors Bureau for a couple of years and then went to do my PhD. So I returned to academia and just sort of felt like this would be a great thing for me to focus on. And actually, my very first published paper on Airbnb, which, as you alluded to, is sort of one of the first papers on Airbnb, really evolved from one of my term papers as a PhD student. And then I studied it for my dissertation. And yeah, at that time it was, telling my thesis committee, hey, let me tell you about Airbnb. Okay, you've never heard of it, but let me discuss what it is, what might happen. I really think it might be a thing. There's something here. And yeah, so sort of then from then on, it's sort of, I really enjoyed looking into it, researching it. And there were all these different aspects to it. There's the guest side, there's the host side, there's the policy side. And so sort of through my work over the past, now decade or whatever, I've just sort of continued to investigate it in a lot of my different research and looking at it from different angles. And now sometimes, I'll get invited to studies that someone else is doing. I hadn't thought about looking at it from that angle, but sure, I'd love to collaborate with you. So it allows me to sort of, again, look at it through tons of different lenses.
Yeah. Yeah, because as you point out, it just, as it keeps evolving and as we start to learn more and more about it, it's just there's so many perspectives to look at it from. A few things there. For one, how easy was it to get your committee on board with this thing that nobody was talking about? It's a double-edged sword in academia. It's like, do something innovative so that and then at the same time, you're kind of, sometimes you work with committees that are like, don't do anything, just get it done.
Yeah.
How receptive were they?
Thankfully, my supervisor, Stephen Smith, was amazing. He was all for it. I came to him with all sorts of ideas that he was like, this is it. Like, this is a great place to sort of focus and plant your flag and sort of build a reputation in a particular area. But there were some other conversations with other faculty, and they're like, really? Like, no one's heard of this. Is that really what you want to focus on? So a little bit, but again, for the most part, it wasn't a big issue.
Well, that's good. And the other part of it is, so I've never really been kind of on the DMO side of it, like you talk about, but just, through teaching and what, just to tell the listeners, when you say the hotel lodging and things like that, that is a huge metric of almost just kind of how we determine how well tourism is doing. Heads in beds, right? That phrase is like, how many heads in beds did we get this last quarter? And then that is indicative. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. As you're trying to estimate the number of tourists, we can't just ticket everybody as they come into a destination. So yeah, your lodging is oftentimes your best sort of proxy indicator of how things are going. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that kind of brings us into this next question then. So if that has been kind of the metric of the way things have been done and measured for however many years, now all of a sudden we've got this new thing that's just getting bigger and bigger, that we can't necessarily keep track of. We don't have the data for. So does that kind of lend us in? I was going to ask you to just kind of break down or simplify what you mean when you say a disruptive innovation.
Sure. So, well, actually, what I'll quickly add is, thankfully, there are some providers who do offer data on short-term rental metrics. So one of them would be AirDNA, another one would be Key Data. So these are companies that essentially, well, actually, they work differently. One of them scrapes the Airbnb calendars and then uses whatever background knowledge algorithm to figure out, okay, what's an actual visitor and what's just, the host is just keeping it for themselves. And then Key Data is plugged into the actual reservation software of some of the different not Airbnb, but some of the vacation rental management companies. So it's not perfect data, but there are ways to get that sort of data. And sorry, what was the question? I went off on that tangent and forgot your real question.
No problem. Just disruptive innovation.
Oh, right,
right. What do we mean by that?
So it can sort of be understood in two ways. That the common way, the sort of colloquial way that people use the term disruptive innovation or a disruption, and honestly, I'm guilty of this myself, is it's just you have this new product that's generally a technology, digital related in some way or another, and it just sort of comes along and shakes up an industry, right? And okay, so it disrupts in a colloquial sense. But if you go back to where it comes from, which is a professor at Harvard named Clayton Christensen, his whole concept is this idea that a disruptive innovation is a product that disrupts an incumbent product by offering an alternative package of benefits. So in other words, you have what are called sustaining innovations, which is you have your iPhone 10 and then your iPhone 11 and your iPhone 12, and each one gets a little bit better. But a disruptive innovation, instead of coming up and being successful because it's better, it's successful because it's actually worse along the traditional performance attributes of the product that's disrupting, but it's convenient, it's cheaper, it's smaller, and it offers this alternative package of benefits. So a good example would be your classic sort of like point and shoot or DSL camera was disrupted by smartphones, right? And those smartphones, if you go way back when, were not very good. They were sort of crappy, but they were convenient because everybody already had a phone in their pocket. So why lug around a camera as well? So it sort of disrupts this camera market, even though it's a worse product, but then over time it gets better. And so my point was, I argue that Airbnb essentially has done this with hotels. Because if we think about sort of the traditional attribute, the performance attributes of hotels, when they're trying to get better, they're offering better service, they're offering better amenities, a nicer swimming pool, they're enhancing their cleaning regimens, they're making the check-in and check-out procedure easier and more efficient. And then Airbnb comes in and the cleanliness maybe not going to be as good, the security maybe not going to be as good, the amenities maybe not going to be as good in terms of the traditional hotel amenities that we think of, but they offer these alternative benefits. Sometimes it's inexpensive compared to hotels. It's oftentimes bigger, so you can have more people. You have the
Mhm.
household amenities. So instead of having, a swimming pool and a weight room and a business center, you have a washing machine and a dryer and a dishwasher and a full refrigerator and a stove. So it's different in that sense. So again, it sort of
Yeah.
it wasn't better than hotels in the ways hotels were trying to always get better themselves. It just sort of
Yeah.
came in and offered this alternative appeal. And then the other side
Yeah.
of that would be the experiential side. So that would be, oh, you can have a more authentic experience, a more local experience. You can leave that, theoretically boring generic hotel room and stay in a home full of color and personality and meet the host and get the local recommendations on the cool neighborhood bar and all that sort of.
Yeah. Well, and we'll get to some of that here in a bit with this authentic experience that Airbnb likes to promote that it can provide. But just while we're on the hotels, uh, again, this is just I've always been on the periphery, right? I go to TTRA, the Travel and Tourism Research Association, and stuff. I don't study this, but of course there's always these sessions, and you always just in those earlier years like 2014, 2016, like you say, it was still just this thing. It was this thing out there, Airbnb. Some groups were excited about it, but you also had groups like the hotels who were just kind of mad about it, of like, it's the new kid on the block, this cool kid's coming into our space, and who do they think they are? But I don't remember if it was from your articles that I was reading this or some other place, but some people who've been studying this kind of from the beginning have said that hotels took a little too long to take it seriously.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I would say both hotels and policymakers to jump ahead.
Mm,
But yeah, you're absolutely
yeah.
right that early on, I think Airbnb was dismissed and it was thought of more as like akin to couch surfing. Um,
Mm,
so even when I was first getting into Airbnb and there wasn't any literature, I was spending a lot of time in the couch surfing literature. If you remember the old couch surfing service
yeah.
that I guess is dead
Hmm.
now, I think it was bought by like Condé Nast and killed off or something. But
Oh
anyways,
God.
yeah, something like that. But anyways, this whole idea that you would just go around and crash on someone's couch for free and buy them a six pack or a pizza or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was dismissed as this, oh, this is for backpackers, this is couch surfing. And actually in the earliest days, this is interesting, a lot of people don't know, the sort of genesis of Airbnb, its origin was initially focused just on sort of shared experiences.
Mm,
So the whole sort of renting a whole unit for yourself wasn't there from the beginning. So anyways,
mm,
that was the sort of origin of the product. And then, so it starts to grow, but the hoteliers are just, oh, whatever. Like this is for backpackers. It might compete with hostels or whatever, but it's not competing with
yeah.
us. And then you sort of go through this period and quickly it flips to shut it down, like you said, anger. Like it goes from we don't care, it's worthless, like it's not competing with us, to okay, it's unfair. The sort of refrain is it's not a level playing field. And there's
Hmm.
some truth to that. It's the
Yeah.
question of, well, is Airbnb collecting the accommodation taxes, the lodging taxes that hotels often have? They're in
Yeah.
Airbnb is operating outside of the zoning restrictions. Hotels are, we can't build there, but they can. And
Exactly.
they say, why are we paying these high property commercial property taxes, but they're paying residential property taxes? So the complaint about it not a level playing field is not outlandish in
Right.
some respects. But yeah, it quickly went from sort of being something that was overlooked to frankly becoming basically a bad word in some circles.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, because like you point out, again, we're just kind of taking away from the conversation right now the all of a lot of the things that we see, the negative impacts and stuff that are happening right now, and just kind of going in. But it really, from a competition standpoint, yeah, it wasn't an even playing field. I mean, the hotels did have a leg to stand on with that. That's how they could offer it so cheap, is they didn't have to add that extra 13% or travel occupancy tax and stuff like that. But they didn't they kind of go across the board? Isn't that when cleaning fees kind of showed up on
Uh,
Airbnbs?
I don't
Do you know off the top of
know.
your
I
head?
I don't know when the cleaning fees arrive, but certainly Airbnb, they sort of fought tooth and nail for a while, if you go back to the early
Mm.
days, against needing to collect those tourism taxes. And
Mm-hmm.
since then, I mean, still going back a while, they sort of wisened up and realized, oh, we can use this as a bit of a carrot and sort of use it in our
Oh,
negotiation. So when we're talking to whatever random jurisdiction and negotiating with the policymakers, it's, hey, and we will collect these taxes and deliver you whatever $5 million a year. But
yeah.
we can't really do that if we're illegal, right? Which is, again, is true.
Yeah.
You can't, the policymakers can't say Airbnb is illegal and we're going to tax it, right? You sort of, you
Right.
can't have your cake and eat it too. So they sort of use that in their negotiations with government, with the regulatory bodies, to say, hey, and we need to be able to operate, whatever, and we'll be able to deliver this pot of money to you every year.
Yeah. And which, I mean, from a local government standpoint, depending, especially if you're a mid-sized city or a small destination, when you're staring that money opportunity in the face, it's like, yeah, come on in. You can kind of see where maybe some places are just kind of let it go on its own for a bit.
Yeah,
Um,
money talks for sure.
it sure does. We can all act like it doesn't, but it sure does.
Yeah.
Uh, so we'll go back, like we say, the perspective. So again, we get right now it is a hot topic, like you said. It's almost a bad word in places. Emotions are very high, tensions are high, things like that. But and I feel like and we talk about this in some of my tourism classes, is it's what we're seeing on the news with kind of the tourist um, getting mad and rising out and kind of lashing out against tourists. It's
Mhm.
like a lot of times that's misplaced anger, because what's really happening is they're feeling like their government has been putting tourism needs and tourist needs above their own for too long, and they've kind of
Mhm.
had enough, and so the tourists are the ones who kind of um, catch the brunt of it right now. Same thing with tourists who are renting an Airbnb, who may not even know that this global conversation is happening. They just went on vacation, and now as they walk out of the Airbnb, they're getting kind of harassed and things like that. And again, not saying one side's right or wrong. There's a lot of gray area and a lot of emotion on this. But one thing about it too is then the hosting side of it.
Mhm.
So let's just kind of talk about why even some people got into this idea of hosting, because you talked about the authentic experiences and being able to actually talk and meet their host and stuff. So like, how and why were people first getting into hosting, and then how has that evolved?
Sure. So, to be honest, I don't have a good sense of how it's changed beyond it's
Mm,
certainly become overall the industry's become more commercialized, more professionalized.
mm,
So I can speculate that it's become more money focused, but I think the bigger point
mm,
is it's just, I would assume, always been it's always been an economic game, a financial
mm.
game, a money making enterprise. That's
Yeah.
really been what's drawn people to it, I think, from the early days on to now. And so, yeah, you may have a bit more of that, even so now, and more commercial operators who are more dedicated to it rather than maybe doing it as a side hustle. But still, at the end of the day, the the opportunity to provide hospitality and meet people from around the world and show your city all feels good. And I'm sure that's sort of the icing on the cake, and some people love it. But if
Hmm.
they could just be doing the couch surfing, right? I'm
Right.
sure if they want to just do it for free, they can find someone for free to stay in their guest bedroom or their empty condo. They're doing it for money. They're
Yeah.
doing it again. Sometimes it's a side hustle. Sometimes it's something to do in between jobs. Sometimes it's, oh, I can make gobs of money when this random big event comes to town, every year.
Right.
Actually, I'm just working on some research right now that hasn't been published yet, I'd mentioned earlier before we started recording that I was down in Panama last year on
Oh,
sabbatical.
yeah.
And so doing some research with a colleague down there, looking at people who had moved from like North America and Europe to Central America to live there and had opened
Mm.
Airbnbs. And really, it was all about sort of facilitating this expat lifestyle. And everybody just sort of saw it as a relatively easy and painless way to make a living. So yeah, it's
Okay.
really just a way. It's always been a way to make money.
Yeah.
It's
That's what
commerce
I
at the end of the
asked.
day.
Yeah, I've asked several of my guests on this topic too, of exactly that. Of at the beginning when it started out and it was really the promotion and everything, where it was this new thing and it was this like altruistic thing where we help you, you help, you get a piece of the tourism pie and all of this. And I always ask that, do you ever think that that's what it was about, or was it always just about the money?
Right. Yeah. And well, and it's wrapped up in the quote unquote sharing economy. It's like, oh, sharing economy. That sounds great. Like sharing is
Right.
good. You teach your kids to share. But I mean, in a
Yeah.
sense, there's some sharing going on if you're sharing like your mortgage payments or what. It's like you're not share like if I ask a friend, like, can you share your, chainsaw? Can I borrow it? And then they charge me, that's not sharing.
Right. That's and I'm just gonna go off the rails here. But that just made me think of this, is that's what I've said, is especially whenever Airbnb introduced Airbnb experiences,
Hmm.
I was just like, the things that they're charging for now are the things that did truly used to happen organically. Like you would go to a bar at a destination or whatever, strike up conversations back when none of us were staring at our phones,
Right.
strike up a conversation with people, and you find out you both really like whiskey, and the person's like, hey, I actually have some time tomorrow. You want me to show you around to some great places? And it's like, yeah. And Airbnb's like, you know what? You could charge people for that.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
just like, it's like the basic niceties of society that just like keep us together. It's like, no, 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 no. You're
Yeah,
leaving money on the table.
100%. I mean, the company, it's what, like a $75 billion market capitalization right now? Like, that's not coming from people just sharing out of the goodness of their heart for no money. It's a business.
Right, right. Uh, okay, so I really like the title of one of your articles that says, please tidy up before leaving. It's kind of talking about, so again, oh, and we love to hear the stories. We love to hear the bad Airbnb stories. I've had on a different
Yeah.
season just somebody who cleans Airbnbs, and she would tell all the crazy stuff that she saw. Um, so can you talk a little bit about that? It says here about influencing guest behavior through subtle nudges. So trying to just hope that people feel good enough about being nice to other people to clean up after themselves.
Yeah, so I love that study and thank you for the kind words, but I have to give credit to my co-author who actually is the one
Mhm.
who ran that whole study. So
Oh,
it
okay.
was his master's thesis, or he was doing, I guess it was like his MBA
Oh,
project. And then he brought me in to help sort of turn it into a publishable work. So I sort of helped
gotcha.
take the research and help him publish it. But anyways, I'm happy to talk about the study, but want to give credit where credit is
Oh,
due.
absolutely.
And
Yeah.
so essentially, he was doing some Airbnb hosting himself and sort of
Mm.
noticed,
Oh,
in different units or whatever, different things that he did, that some guests would tend to be, nicer or better of cleaning up, of, stripping the bed or whatever when they left. So the clever experiment he came up with was essentially, he did it in a few different ways, but essentially it's like, if I introduce these sort of like social presence cues, these social cues to show that there's a human being who actually owns this unit, who's going to be back here, who's going to be the one cleaning it, is that going to affect the guest behavior? So those social cues would be something like pictures of his family, or something like that.
okay.
Again, so just sort of um, illustrating that this isn't just a random hotel room. Like, this is a home for a real person. And so it sort of changes the nature, maybe psychologically, of the relationship, in that person's mind of, okay, this is just a random room. I'm going to come in and get out, to no, I'm actually staying in someone's home. And so what he found, what the article reports, is indeed about that by introducing those cues, or by doing things like writing, leaving a little handwritten note,
Oh,
asking, oh, do you mind cleaning up? That people were actually much better at doing what they'd been asked to do, of stripping the linens and things like that.
really? Okay.
So you could sort of nudge the guests into being a little bit better as guests and doing the things you wanted.
Yeah. I mean that it takes on a whole new meaning and and things, the results of that, when we think about who are owning most of the Airbnbs, and then the tourists are still getting charged. So it's
Yeah.
so, but it is almost kind of like just a sociological study, right? To be like,
Mhm.
okay, if we tell people that other people are involved, I would be interested to see that study again right now
Yeah.
taking place.
Yeah, you're
Because
absolutely right. That the stuff changes. And
yeah,
supposedly everyone's worse post-COVID. Everyone's just rude. So yeah.
that's what I was going to ask you about. I mean, you're in Charleston, South Carolina, like the number one. Are you the number one in the world or the US?
In the U.S., but yeah, known for Southern hospitality. Absolutely, that's a big
Exactly.
part of the DNA of the hospitality sector here.
Yeah. And so, but so have you noted? Well, you've been away, like you said. You've been
Yeah,
down in
and
Panama.
I'm not at the front desk of the hotel, so I don't notice
That's
anything.
true.
But I have heard from some of my students actually who work in restaurants and such that
Mm,
they say it can be a little bit rough. You deal with a little bit more rude behavior than maybe you were seeing 5 years ago.
yeah. That's what I've heard too. Um, and I don't, like I say, or like you say, I don't work in that either. But I'm just around people a lot.
Yeah, exactly. You hear
I
things.
think most, yeah, I think most of us feel that way. Maybe all of us are just, maybe all of our patience level is just
Yeah.
lower.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Who else do we want to talk about? Um, or what else? So yeah, again, we've got kind of we've flirted a little bit with the policy and the challenges and the things like that. Before we really get kicked off into it, has Charleston is Charleston doing anything right now, or is it just kind of like just in the whisper phase?
No, they've been on it for since pre-COVID. It was
Okay.
around like 2018. They really jumped into it. Sort of like many destinations, they sort of came up with the regulations and then struggled to enforce it. And then since then, sort of have found other ways to sort of be more, what would the word, I don't know if successful would be the right word, but I guess, yeah, successful in enforcing the rules that they'd
Mm,
established. So for example, using some third-party software that triangulates or whatever and identifies where these listings are. But what's interesting about Charleston is that it's really like several destinations in one. So you have sort of the
oh
downtown
yeah.
peninsula, which is sort of the classic, what a lot of people think of when they think of Charleston, and the architecture and the horse carriages and all that stuff. But then,
Hmm.
so like where I am, I live in a suburb of Charleston, which for all intents and purposes is the same city. It takes me, I cross the bridge, but it's a different
Hmm.
jurisdiction with different dynamics. And then you have several
Gotcha.
beach communities. And even within the beach communities, you have, like, for example, one beach community that is very open to short term vacation rentals, has had them forever, and Airbnb is sort of just a new platform for them, a new distribution channel. Whereas another beach community down the road is much more restrictive and now is wrestling with how much they want to sort of clamp down on this sort of behavior, the short-term rentals. So yeah, it's definitely an issue here, and it sort of flares up at different moments in the different jurisdictions that together comprise Charleston. But yeah, absolutely
Gotcha.
a major topic here.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like that you point out the community that has had vacation rentals for a long time. And I think that's especially when we talk about it from a tourism perspective. So when we're talking about short-term rentals from all kinds of other different perspectives, I get that we really just kind of focus on the housing stock and stuff that Airbnb has been shown to take away from areas. But short-term rentals are not new in tourism destinations, especially these kind of coastal towns. And so when we have these conversations and we do talk about it, it's not, I don't think the goal for many people in tourism is to erase a tourist option of a short-term rental of like a cottage or something like that, right? Because they've kind of always been around. It's more
Right.
so of the way in which kind of Airbnb can just get its fingers into a community, and it's so hard to rein it in once it's in there.
Yeah, that's 100% right. And there is sometimes it comes up in conversation like Airbnb is a product. No, Airbnb is a distribution channel, and it's really both.
Yeah.
That if you look at, say, like you're saying, the cottage, cottages or lake communities, beach communities that have just sort of embraced vacation rentals forever. For them, they were
Mm-hmm.
using HomeAway and now, Vrbo and whatever. And now they're listed on Airbnb as well. And it's just sort of the same old song, just with a new place that they're selling their product. But
Mm-hmm.
so in that sense, it is a distribution channel, but it is also a product and a phenomenon in the sense that you look at some places like, for example, downtown Charleston on the peninsula, and there's simply a whole lot more short-term rentals than there were pre-Airbnb, that it sort of triggers this shift of some real
Mm-hmm.
estate, some housing units from something else, whatever it was being used for before, into being used for short-term rentals. And yeah, absolutely. Sort of the way it's evolved and unfolded is, policymakers is again sort of dismissive of it, not really on the ball, and then it's there, and now, oh gosh, how do we react to it? It's always been sort of reacting rather than preempting, and sort of how do we want it to enter and evolve in our community? No, it just sort of, it's the classic tech, move fast and break things. That's what they did. They didn't worry
Yeah.
about changing the laws. They just got scale. They just scaled really quickly, and then they're there, and then everybody has to respond to it, which,
Yeah.
again, is tough for policymakers, but smart for Airbnb's growth.
Right. Yeah, because it does feel like it takes a while for the symptoms to start showing up. But Airbnb's been around for so long, they know the game, so they can kind of get out in front of it. So then once it's time for your community to try and react to it, as you say, sometimes Airbnb will already have things in place that make it so much harder to do it.
Yeah, they've
And
got
I,
tons of units, and whatever, the nice lady down the street who's doing this to pay her mortgage, who gets, paraded out. Are you really gonna, make her lose her ability to pay her mortgage? So yeah,
yeah.
it's tough.
Yeah, and I find myself, even as I'm saying that, uh, I found myself saying Airbnb and acting as though like Airbnb is an entity that can control itself and not. It's the same way that people talk about tourism of like tourism did this. It's like, well, tourism can't act on its own. People
Right.
are making choices, people are making decisions, and it's the same thing with Airbnb, which maybe that's part of their model of success is it is kind of so secretive. We don't necessarily, the household names for all of the other big tech companies we know, but I don't know if many people know it's like the originator of Airbnb is not a household name. So we don't think of people,
Right,
right?
not like Elon Musk or something. Yeah, you're right.
Right. Yeah. We can't just focus around a person and hate that person.
Y-
We're just like, Airbnb's doing this. And every single person's like, I know it's just Airbnb. What can you do?
Yeah, it's a thing. It's a verb now as well.
Exactly.
Which is
Yeah.
a mark of their success, frankly.
Well, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. There's some things you can't deny. I mean, they
Yeah.
have been successful at what they set out to do.
Yeah, 100%.
And if
100%.
only at this point they would use their success for good.
Yeah.
um, but so we'll go. back again, I keep, and it's my fault, I keep going way forward. But let's talk about from the tourist perspective too. So again, from those early days where it was something, where it was an alternative, and again, like we say, it was kind of pitched as this sharing economy. So at that point, you're already going to get people who are just kind of really into the new next big thing, stuff like that. And so kind of how has the tourist who has sought out short-term rentals or Airbnb specifically, kind of evolved and changed?
Sure, yeah. So I'll sort of say two things. One thing is even from pretty early on, it's always been just like the hosting is more about making money than all the, feel good, meet people from around the world. The guest perspective, the guest motivation, similarly, is much more about those pragmatic, practical benefits. It's okay, I can save money because I'm traveling with 6 people, so we would need 2 hotel rooms or 3 hotel rooms. Now we can just get 1 unit. I can find through Airbnb locations that are much more convenient for me, because maybe I want to stay in a part of town where there just aren't hotels. And again, having the space of a home, having the amenities of a home, all that stuff has really been the driver of what pulls people to use Airbnb, rather than, okay, I'm having, a transformative, authentic experience. I'm going to become a local here in Paris for 3 days. That I think that's part of it. I don't want to negate that completely, that people do like that. There is a sense of, oh, I don't want to stay in just another random generic hotel. Like, it'll be cool to stay in an apartment building and be surrounded by some Parisians. Like, there is an element of that. But certainly the practical thing has always been that primary motivator. Then secondly, in terms of how things have unfolded, it's sort of exactly how you've alluded to and exactly really what you would expect, which is that the earlier adopters tended a bit more towards that more adventurous side of the spectrum, right? If we, as tourism academics, the plug, right, the allocentrics, right, they're just more adventurous, more backpackery, more interested in that local interaction. But over time, now it's just everybody and their parents are doing, are using the service. It's just a mainstream product. And so as it attracts sort of more mainstream customers, it's just people who are, whatever. I'm not Airbnb backpacker, whatever. It's just, okay, this is a convenient place to stay at a good price. And yeah, or the hotels, there's there's an event in town. There's like no hotels are booked. Whatever's available is super pricey. Let me just grab this Airbnb. So it's just sort of become your everyday mainstream traveler, which has consequences for Airbnb and for the hosts. So the company and the hosts, in the sense of, so I've done some research on this and basically found that these later adopters compared to the earlier adopters in general were just not quite as happy, had sort of higher expectations. So satisfaction a bit lower, expectations a bit higher, much more likely to just sort of be using hotels, use Airbnb every once in a while. So they're going to be tougher customers to keep happy, again, both for the company and for your random host, who, again, instead of having someone who's sort of, I'm part of this Airbnb community, which actually, if you go back and we were talking about the founder, his name, since I do research, I do know his name, Brian Chesky. Like from day one, he sort of wanted to develop Airbnb as a community. And so I think there was more of that, oh, I love the ethos of Airbnb. I want to be part of this movement early on. And now it's just like, okay, it's just another lodging option. I can stay in a hotel, I can stay in a bed and breakfast, I'll stay in a short-term rental, whatever. So yeah, it's a different type of customer and not as easy to please and probably not as forgiving when, the bathroom isn't completely clean or the check-in isn't completely smooth. That they're comparing it to a hotel essentially now.
Right. Yeah, that's what, as soon as you were saying that, that's what I was thinking of, is right when we opened and you were talking about that, of like it came out as this product that was different, and it was a lesser product. It didn't give us exactly what we were used to in a hotel, but now the people who use it that's all they're thinking of it. So they walk in with that expectation. And I was
Right.
thinking, this is just, you're in tourism all the time and everything. So this question, whether you want to speak on it or not, but it makes me think of, there is a lot. This is why this actually where the name of this podcast came from is You're a Tourist and It's Okay, is because of just my annoyance with people refusing to call themselves a tourist. It's, I'm a traveler and not a tourist. And it's like, the problem is with, if when you don't think of yourself as a tourist, then that means you refuse to go to where the city has asked you to go
Right.
and stay. And you just feel like you're entitled to go wherever you want to go in that home and act and do however you want. And so that's why I'm like, admit it, you're a tourist, because that is what you are, no matter what type of accommodation that you're staying in. And the place who, you say Southern Hospitality, who has graciously invited you into their home, has said, and we'd really appreciate it if you could just kind of stay in these areas and give the
Right.
people who live here a little bit of a break from tourism. And whenever we take that label off of ourselves, we're like, well, they're talking to them, not me.
Right.
So that's what my question is like, just the fact that Airbnb use that as their promotion for so long, of like, travel authentically, live like a local, everything else. Do you think that that has also kind of almost changed the landscape of how tourists act?
Yeah, I mean, I think it
This is like a
certainly
big
is.
overarching
Yeah, yeah, I don't
question.
know. I mean, I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. It has been part of their promotion. I think it is an aspiration for a lot of travelers. I want to see the quote unquote backstage. I want to see real life. I don't
Yeah.
just want to go take pictures of the statues and go to the big museum and what have you. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I think there is an element of that. How much it's actually sort of affect, like, I don't know where the cause and I don't know where the chicken and the egg is, if it's sort of
Mm-hmm.
Airbnb is sort of promoting that mentality versus it's just benefiting from that mentality.
That's
It could
true.
frankly probably be a little bit of both. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, but certainly you're absolutely right. There's no question that sort of what makes Airbnb so fascinating and so challenging is it does blur these boundaries between these sort of tourist spheres and geographic regions. And it's like, okay, if I go to the Louvre, like, I'm gonna be surrounded by tourists. Like, if I live in
Yeah.
Paris and I go to the Louvre, like, I know that. That's okay. If I go to the Eiffel Tower, I'm going to be surrounded by tourists. But it used to be, but if I go back to my condo building, then I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
But now Airbnb has blurred those boundaries, and now suddenly the condo building and the neighborhood street are also sort of quote unquote touristified. And so
Yeah.
there's no question talking about Airbnb as being a product and a phenomenon, not just this distribution channel, is it has really been the product that's produced this change of just sort of pushing tourists everywhere. Now, the other sort of
Yeah.
ironic part of all this is when we talk about over tourism, one way to deal with over
Mm-hmm.
tourism is to try and spread people out a little bit more, and try
Guess
not
that's
to have
true.
everybody in the exact same place where it's just so overwhelming in certain spots. But
Yeah.
you're absolutely right that the sort of byproduct of that and the byproduct of Airbnb is we've sort of knocked down these walls between tourism areas and residential areas, and that creates challenges. 100%.
Yeah. Because it's I can just, whenever you were talking, the thing that made me think of that was when you were saying that the guests, kind of the most current guests now that use Airbnbs, are less satisfied and things like that. And so it's like, so then, yes, they may be staying in a home that's not a hotel, but they're still expecting that standardized experience, that I can walk into this place and I essentially am going to be able to predict everything that I see in there. And if not, I'm going to raise hell
Yeah.
about it. And so it's like, So that's where I was kind of getting, it's like the live like a local side, but it's like, look at the houses around you, and are the houses around you like that? And then we see the kind of the cascading effects of when places have to have that standardized things for tourists, then we start to see more and more and more of them. And that's where I
Mhm.
think a lot of the communities start to get a little nervous, because when we've seen that happen through different measures in tourism destinations in over time, when the revitalization of downtowns came in and we turned them into like Times Square into tourism spaces, there were a lot of negative strategies to make those places clean and sanitized for
Right.
the tourists. And so that's where it's when we start cleaning and sanitizing neighborhoods is that's
Mhm.
it. You can see where the communities are rightfully nervous. Yeah.
Right. And it just changes the dynamic.
Yeah.
Just changes the fabric of the community in the sense of,
Yeah.
okay, well, I used to go out and I'm seeing all my neighbors, but now I got Airbnbs around me and it's, tourists on the street who are lost. And, I lost my dry cleaner and my bakery, and now it's a souvenir shop and a pizza place or a bar that's really catering to tourists. So literally the people, like the human beings change, the shops, in some places change. So, the things you have available to you change. And then there's just sort
Yeah.
of the general annoyances that can come with sort of being surrounded by tourists or by Airbnbs more specifically. I think that, a lot of us having Airbnb available to you when you're traveling is really nice, whether you use it or not. You just know
Mhm.
it's an option. Sometimes you'll use it, sometimes you won't. But you don't see a lot of people who are like, what I would really love is for my neighbor to be an Airbnb, right? That's just not
That's
what people think.
true. Yeah.
There's a really cool study. It was just like a random industry study survey done like 10 years ago, but I love it. So they asked people they asked two sets of people a different question. They asked set one, should people in your community be allowed to rent their homes on platforms like Airbnb, something like that. And then they asked group two, should your neighbor be allowed to rent his or her home on a platform like Airbnb? And of course, when the respondents were asked about in general, a lot more people were supportive of it and a lot fewer had an issue with it. But when you phrase that same question specifically
Oh,
about the neighbor, even though the neighbor is part of the community, now all of a sudden a
right.
lot of people were against it and there was much less support. So it's one of those
Yeah.
things that it's almost like a NIMBY thing. It's like, yeah, it's great,
That's
but
what
I don't want it
yeah,
near me. Which again, like I
exactly.
understand. I don't want to go, my neighbor to become an Airbnb and my kids are out in the backyard and I don't know who's in the backyard and what sort of random, bachelor party is there for the weekend. Like I wouldn't like that. It's understandable.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, and that's what whenever you were saying that I was like, yeah, that's just essentially right there the definition of NIMBY of. But what do you think let's talk about it for the tourist. So if you are going to go, how do you think that like a tourist could be more responsible if you're going to use a short-term rental um in a neighborhood, like, yeah.
I,
Is
I
there
mean,
a way? The only reason I'm so slow on asking this question, I was like, I don't know. Is there even
yeah,
a way?
I mean, I think sort of the start, maybe the easy answer is like, okay, if you know what you're doing is illegal, maybe it's not the right choice, right? Normally, I
Mm,
think in reality, people probably don't find out until later, and you hear stories of like, hey, if anybody asks, you need to tell them you're my cousin or my friend from high school or something, and say you're just, I let you stay here for free. Um,
oh,
so if you know before booking that you're either breaking that unit is breaking the law or breaking some sort of, condo board rules or something, that you're going to have to lie to, if anybody asks, and maybe that's not the best place to stay. Um, then I'd say to some degree, there's an element of, think about the basic annoyances that might come when you're a guest. which,
Mm.
if you're coming home, you're going out to the club or the bar and you're coming home, staggering at 3 a.m., like don't yell in the hallways.
Yeah.
And, if you have a 3 a.m. flight and you're in a condo building, when you're, try not to make a ton of noise, like lugging, rolling your suitcase across the floor at 3 a.m. to get to the airport, because that's the sort of stuff that's going to drive people crazy. But in some sense, that's like just common decency of what you should do,
Right.
as a basic human being with your own neighbors in an apartment building or a condo building or a neighborhood anyways. Um,
Yeah.
and the flip side of that is, all that stuff is okay. And that's sort of part of the
Hmm.
challenge is, if you're going out and traveling and, part of that, some people are going to go party and they want to come home late. Like, again,
Hmm.
don't be wildly boisterous, but that's okay. Like, there's nothing wrong with doing that on
Yeah.
vacation. There's nothing, people are going to have flights early morning, and you can't just become like invisible and just float out of the door. Like, you're going to make some noise. So to
Yeah.
some degree, these issues are just sort of inevitable. But I think the big part is just almost trying to behave on vacation with the same consideration that you might behave in your daily life, and not treat it as, okay, I'm on vacation, I don't care. Like, remember that you're on vacation, but for other people, like they're going to be waking up at 6:30 for work. Like, this is just another day in the life for them. It's not their
Yeah.
bachelorette party or whatever. So let's be considerate of that. Um, yeah, so just sort of that
Yeah.
same decency that hopefully people would show always. And yeah, not having the attitude of, I'm on vacation, I get to do what I want, and I'm never going to see these people again. So what do I care?
Right.
Because I'm
Right.
sure you are going to have people who have that attitude. Like, whatever, I'm flying out tomorrow. I can, drop a metal ball on the floor, and what do I care? I don't have to deal with the neighbor. That's someone else's fun. So
Exactly.
hopefully that's, not going to be most people. But again, I think that's just common decency. But then taking a step further, it's not really beyond that their responsibility of, like, that's an issue for the policymakers and Airbnb. Like, there are going to
Right.
be certain annoyances in having an Airbnb, and that it's not really the tourist job to say, okay, well, I'm going to be tucked into bed at 8 a.m. every night, at 8 p.m. every night, so that I don't disturb the neighbors. Like, that's not
Right.
reasonable.
And I think you brought up some great points with that, where it's this idea of, again, that authentic experience, that live like a local. So if you want to live like a local, unfortunately that means you've got to not act like you're the only person in the universe, which is hard to do because, for one, like you say, tourists, you shouldn't have to. It is your vacation. You have spent a lot of money on it. You do want to have fun when you're doing it. um but it's like I always say, they're kind of, tourists are like a bride. It's just like they feel like they're the most important, and it's everybody else's responsibility to make sure that their day goes perfect. And so that's kind of what I think is it's almost like, think about the trip that you're wanting. And like you say, if it is a bachelorette party, you're in Charleston. I thought that would be a good
Yeah.
example to throw out. If it is a bachelorette party, then yeah, maybe, I know an Airbnb is enticing because all of you can stay in the same house and everything else. But like, is that the type of party that belongs in a sleepy neighborhood?
Right.
Like, do a little bit of research and make sure that it's not just a primarily residential neighborhood that's kind of far away from the tourist areas and stuff like that. Because, like you say, I mean, it's not everybody's vacation. But when
Right.
you do stay in a hotel or when you do stay in a tourist area, um, more often than not, it is everybody on vacation. And hey, from a tourist perspective, you might find a lot more people to hang out with
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than get glares from the neighbors.
Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, I mean, I've heard stories here of, oh yeah, the little neighborhood pool gets filled up with, yeah, like bachelorette parties because there's some unit
Oh,
that's renting on
wow.
Airbnb. And then I don't, not me personally, but I've heard, anecdotally, I don't want to take my kids there because it's just not as appealing. And yeah, I think
Yeah.
amusingly, it gets back to this idea of live like a local, because I think
Mm.
aspirationally, a lot of people do want that sense of, I'm not a tourist, I'm a traveler. I'm seeing the real Charleston or the real Paris or the real London or whatever. But you don't really go on
Yeah.
vacation to live like a local, right? Like if you
No.
want to live like a local, then okay, set your alarm for 6, get dressed, like make your lunch in the morning and go fight traffic on the subway with commuting with everybody
Right.
else. Like that's not at all what you want. What you want is to travel and have a great travel experience, as you're saying, with a little bit of a local flavor sort of interspersed
Yeah.
within it.
Exactly. And again, I think that's a main point is, and it's okay to admit that that's what you want. That you
Right.
want this just like I because that's where we get the benefits of tourism. That's why, it's I get, and I don't know about you, but kind of in my day to day, whenever I talk critically about tourism, like this, I get a lot of people say, well, you just hate tourism and you hate all things tourism. And it's like, absolutely not. I want to make sure that more people have access to it because there are benefits. We should all have the opportunity to go places. But the main thing is that our freedom to go and do whatever we do should not take away other people's freedom to live in the neighborhood that they saved up a ton of money and bought a house and wanted to raise kids in a peaceful, quiet neighborhood. I don't think as a tourist, you should feel like your desires trump those desires. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hadn't really thought about it right now, or I hadn't thought about it until right now in this conversation, but talking about sort of the whole other over tourism thing and the protests
Mm-hmm.
and the water gun squirting in Barcelona and those things that Airbnb is
Mm-hmm.
sort of related to, even though,
Mm-hmm.
there's certainly some overlap between the two. But that seems to have like recently, like over the past year, sort of broken through from being this thing that,
Mm-hmm.
tourism academics would talk about of, whatever the iridex and people getting frustrated with tourism to now it's just in the New York Times and in the,
Right.
it's just in the mainstream media, not as a topic of tourism study, just as a topic of, again, just general culture. And so I think it'll be
Mm-hmm.
interesting to see as more people just in the general public become aware of some of these frustrations. Again, like reading the New York
Yeah.
Times, it's like every week there's an article is like about Greece, about Ibiza, about Barcelona. I think it'll be interesting to see if there is more sort of cognizance, more awareness, and more consideration of, okay, yeah, as you said, I want to be a tourist, I want to go enjoy myself, but I need to think about those secondary effects and do what I can to minimize it. And I have no idea if
Yeah.
it'll sort of change the public consciousness a little, move that needle a tiny bit, or not. But
Mm-hmm.
it certainly feels like it has the potential to, just because again, I think over the past year it's broken out of a tourism topic to just a general topic of conversation
Yeah.
and of news stories.
Yeah, because that's I do the same activity kind of the first week of my intro to tourism class, and I have everybody find. I just the idea is like to point out, you know what, you see news about tourism every single day. You just don't realize it. So it's like go out, find a news story, and most of the time, what they'll come back with is our typical tourism news story of look how many jobs it's brought, look how
Yeah.
much money it's brought, right? Our quarterly headlines of that. And they're primarily positive ones. This semester, it was so many of them had only found the negative ones that I even had to say at one point, okay, did anyone find a positive one? And nobody raised their hand. And I was like, to be honest, my little heart felt good because more people are talking about it. Like
Right.
you say, it has gone out of tourism conferences and people are seeing it. Now, if the media is gonna hammer it too hard negative on one side, we don't know, like you say, because it's not all negative. But right
100%.
now it is a hot story to cover is the negative sides of it. And hopefully,
Yeah.
so that's what I'm even finding is sometimes it would take a whole semester to get my intro to tourism students to even think of tourism beyond the vacation they went on, and that
Hmm.
equals tourism. But they're already like in tune with it, and they know that there are some negative impacts, and they're trying to figure out, how can I be a better tourist? How can I not contribute? So, people talk a lot about Gen Z, but they're making me feel good this
Yeah,
semester.
yeah, that's fascinating. Actually, hearing that it's just shifted 100% practically in
Yeah.
a short period from what they come across. I guess
Yeah.
I again I believe it because that's sort of been my experience, but because I look at it through a different lens of a professor who studies this for a living. Yeah, I wasn't a hundred
Right.
percent sure, how your random person who doesn't take a huge interest in tourism would come across this
Yeah.
stuff. That's interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so my last question here to I don't know, to wrap us up with the
Sure.
bow. When we talk about regulations and things like that. Um so we know we've got places globally who are putting a lot of strict regulations. We know we've got places in the US like New York City, San Francisco, who are putting some strict regulations on. We know that there's enforcement issues. Cities just don't have money or resources to enforce the regulations, things like that. Do you think that we can make some headway and almost kind of put the genie back in the bottle, without extreme cases of holding Airbnb accountable? Like, what role does the platform itself? Can we do it without them?
Oh,
Or are they
yeah.
always going to be a step ahead of us?
Yeah, I think the answer is probably no. So I was about to say, oh yeah, well the way you can do it is you have to involve Airbnb and sort of not act independently. They need to be brought in. They need to be held accountable, as you said. So yeah, I think the answer is no, in the sense of you can't just organically hope that whatever all of the challenges, and again I do, because we have talked a lot about the challenges. I think it's worth noting there are, just same with tourism, there are a lot of great things that come from Airbnb for the hosts,
Yeah.
for the communities, for the tourists. There's the good side and there's the bad side. There's challenges and there's huge benefits. So but
Mm-hmm.
anyways, yeah, I don't think you can just sort of tackle those challenges and, if the idea is to sort of reduce it or change its nature to, reshape it, I don't think you can just do that hoping that, people are going to change and feel, oh, I'm hosting, but I should really just, from the good of my heart, rent to a long-term tenant for a year instead of doing this Airbnb thing. um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think at the end of the day, it always ends up being dealt with. The only way, for better or worse, is through regulation, through involving
Mm-hmm.
Airbnb. Yeah, having them accountable to some degree for what goes on, who's publishing their listings on the platform. If there's quotas, if it's whatever, 90 days, 90 nights a year, if they're helping to enforce that restriction of, once it hits 90 days, Airbnb, you cannot list them anymore. Um,
Yeah.
it's still tough because you got Verbo, you got other platforms. So, but
Sure.
yeah, I think just ignoring the platforms and saying, you guys do what you want, but we're going to be able to organically sort it out. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, because like you said, I mean, yeah, you brought up a great point. It does provide opportunity. And the fact is, and this is going, I mean, hotel folks, I mean, I'm not trying to talk bad about you, but but you took a long time to take them seriously. And also, it doesn't, I'm sure that there are boutique hotels out there trying to do this and stuff, but it's almost like you're not looking at what draws people to an Airbnb and makes them choose an Airbnb over a hotel. Like, we're still seeing all of this. We know that families, we know that groups, we know the benefits of staying in Airbnb over a hotel, to do it. But yet, the hotels, from what I'm seeing, aren't doing anything to change to provide different options. Right? We could set up hotels like condo buildings to where
Mm-hmm.
you could rent out a suite or, something like that. But have you seen anything
Not
in the
much.
works?
Yeah, I mean, you have, I think some hotel companies have dipped their toe more directly into the short-term rental world. Just you have like Marriott Homes and Villas, which is just sort of their
Mm,
own vacation rental entity within the Marriott family. And I think a lot of the success that they would have comes from loyalty points and all that sort of thing. Um,
gotcha.
and I think there has been some element of the hotel sort of pushing to be a little bit more of an experience, a little bit more local flavor. But I think
Hmm.
a bigger shift has come from other players, like the big one in the US will be Sonder. I don't know if you're familiar with
Hmm.
Sonder, but Sonder
No.
is a company and they basically like buy up. I think that they would buy like either old hotels or like condo buildings and yeah, sort of transform essentially a condo building into like a hotel. And so their success comes from they get whatever zoned and licensed whatever as like a hotel. So they're operating legally and they sort of operate basically like a hotel, but without sort of, there's not going to oftentimes be a front desk. You just sort of like you check
Mm,
in with the code on your phone. So it's more like an Airbnb, and the units are more designed like Airbnbs, like mini,
mm,
apartments or condos or studios or what have you. So that's sort of
yeah.
the closest of this. And there are some other businesses like that. Saunders sort of the biggest one, I believe, in the US. There's a few in Europe. I forget the names. But they are sort of shooting for that middle ground of trying to get sort of quote unquote the best of both worlds. So, the
Yeah.
professional cleaning and that sort of thing, the professional communication, you don't have to worry about
Yeah.
legality and all that stuff, but you get the amenities, sort of the design of what you would expect more with an Airbnb. What you
Yeah.
lose then is the authenticity side and all that of you're not seeing the local Parisians or whatever in the hallway. But again,
Hmm.
that's really secondary or less for a lot of tourists. So,
Yeah.
so yeah,
Well,
there is
that's,
some
yeah.
some movement. But at the same time, I think you're right that I think there's more that hotels could do of saying, how can we sort of offer our quality of service, our guarantees of service, our professional cleaning, but offer units that are more akin to what people get on Airbnb that might work for, you know, two families
Yeah.
of four or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And just like you say too of the cleaning and stuff, when we talk about that, the important side of that too is a regulated workforce.
Right.
Because again, that's Airbnb doesn't have to, we don't know who's cleaning it. So we don't know how much these people are getting paid. We don't know anything like that, how these workers are being treated. We know that we pay a cleaning fee, but we have no idea where that money goes to. Whereas, at least in a hotel or something that's operating as the actual commercial business that these rentals are, at least then we can keep track of stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
good. I'm gonna have to look up that place. I had not heard of it.
Yeah, yeah, it's a
So
cool. Again, it's not huge like Airbnb and Marriott,
mhm.
but I don't know exactly when it started. Sort of, I think before the pandemic. But yeah, sort of these businesses shooting for that middle ground of trying to pull the
Yeah.
best parts of the hotel experience and the Airbnb experience.
Yeah, because I mean, that's when we say that we can't just hope for hosts not to do it. We also can't hope for tourists not to do it. I mean, we've been shown it. It'd be like if people just took the iPhones out of our hands and be like, now you're going to go back to Nokia's, and it's like, but we've tasted
Yeah,
the iPhone, so it's like until something better or comparable comes along, then we really it's hard to say for tourists just don't use them
yeah,
because for some people that's just not an option, depending on what's going on with it.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I agree.
okay, so that's good because again there's just and I love our conversation today because we've done I think you've done a great job of pointing out the perspectives of everyone involved. And it's just this thing that we know there's problems. And like we said, especially kind of the anger emotions, and community groups who are rising up and things like that. It's just, there's a mystery as to who to be mad at. So it's a lot of times the groups are just extremely mad at the local government, and sometimes rightfully so. Sometimes the local government's not even attempting to put in regulations.
Sure.
But sometimes the local government's hands are tied too, because again, when Airbnb's not handing over the data, it's hard to make good policy decisions, whenever you don't even really know what you're working with. So folks rising up,
Yeah.
take a little bit of that energy and put it toward the platform to get them to be held accountable too a bit.
Yeah, it's tough to craft the policy, and then it's tough to enforce the policy.
Yeah.
Sometimes even more so. And yeah, there's lots of different vested interests, and it's both. Again, it is a platform that's driving somebody rightfully and understandably crazy, because again, they can't enjoy their home, right? Their home
Mm-hmm.
to the same way that they feel understandably that they should. And at the same time, it genuinely is the platform that is providing, an economic lifeline for people, and something that, important money in people's pockets, and
Yeah.
a great service that a lot of tourists like. So it's both. Again, both the good and the bad are both very real. And that's what I
Yeah.
find is fascinating. And that's what makes it such a cool but challenging topic.
Exactly. That's what makes tourism in general
Exactly.
just a
Exactly.
fascinating thing to study. There's never a black and white. There's never a yes or no. There's always gray areas, always things to figure out. All
Absolutely.
right, Daniel. Is there any place, if somebody is listening to this and they want to reach out to you and get a little bit more information from you, talk to you about your work, is there any place that they can find you?
The best place would just be just email me. If you Google my name, Daniel Guttentag, Guttentag, you'll find my profile page of College of Charleston and my email address. And yeah, anybody can feel more than free to reach out, but that would just be the best place to find me. I don't have some like fancy like tourism professor Instagram or anything like that. TikTok, nothing like that. Yeah.
All right. And so, for all the listeners out there, for all things tourism, be sure to subscribe or like or follow this podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Follow us on Instagram and TikTok at You're a Tourist. And remember, you can call yourself whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you're a tourist and it's okay. The first step to getting better is admitting it.